Hello and welcome to this week's video. This week we're going to be looking at the basics of photography in just under 10 minutes. So if you've recently bought a camera or you're thinking about getting into photography, this is the video for you. The purpose of this video is to help you the first time you go out with your camera because it can be a very daunting experience. So we're going to look at 5 things today. We're going to look at the gear that you need. We're going to talk a little bit about the exposure triangle so you understand how your camera works. Then we're going to look at composition, how to make your photograph stand out amongst everybody else's. Then we're going to look at locations, where to go to shoot. And finally, we're going to look a little bit at post-processing and getting your photographs onto the computer and turning them into something that you can be proud of and hang on your wall. So part 1, gear. What do you need? Obviously you need a camera, and secondly you need a lens. Now that sounds very straightforward, but there are loads of camera bodies out there that you can buy and there are thousands of lenses to choose from. I'm also going to assume at this stage you might not know exactly what field you would like to specialise in. I had a feeling I wanted to do landscape photography, but I also wanted to have telephoto zooms, I wanted to have really wide angle lenses, I wanted ones that blurred out the background. I spent so much money on lenses that since then I've sold or traded in, and I have wasted literally thousands of pounds doing so. So what I would recommend you do is get a variable lens. So instead of it being a fixed length at say 50mm or 80mm, get something like a 24-70, or Canon do a 24-105, which means that you can zoom in or you can zoom out. The great thing about that is it gives you a bit of flexibility, and it also means that you only need one lens. I can't stress how important that is because there's other things you're going to need to spend your money on. Also, it'll give you some time to find out where in the 24-70 range your preferences lie. If you find that you're shooting a lot at 24, then you might want to investigate buying some more lenses at that end. However, if you find yourself shooting more at the 70mm end of the focal range, you might want to invest in a telephoto zoom like a 70-200. When you first start out, buy things that you will use because there's other things that you're going to need. Depending on the style of shooting that you're going to do, for example, if it's landscape, you're going to need a tripod. You can buy a tripod off Amazon for about £20, but I would urge you not to do that because they're not really worth the money. They're shaky, they're built really poorly. If you get any sort of wind, it'll pick up the shake in the camera. A tripod is really something that you don't want to skimp on, so get the one that you can afford and spend as much money as you can afford on a tripod. You will thank me for that later on. It helps you get more stable shots, it helps you slow the shutter down in low light conditions. There's just a whole host of things. I'm using a tripod just now because I'm shooting this for YouTube, and if that's something that you're planning to do, you're definitely going to need a tripod at some point. The last thing that you're going to need is you're going to need memory cards to store your photographs on and a bag to carry it all in. If you've got that, a bag, a memory card, camera body, a lens and a tripod, you're good to go. Get that in the back of the car and get out and see what you can find. How do you use your camera and what is the exposure triangle? Now don't be scared, the exposure triangle sounds more complicated than it is, and depending on who you speak to, the answer you get can sound quite convoluted and confusing, but it's really very simple. Before I cover that, what I would say is, if you get a camera, there will be lots of different modes on it, from fully manual to fully automatic, and there's some different modes in between. I would strongly urge you to start on fully manual. There is a myth about shooting in manual that it's far too difficult and it's much better to start on auto or one of the other modes and work your way up to shooting in manual mode. I entirely disagree with this. I'm going to give you a quick analogy here. Imagine if you started a job tomorrow and your job was to answer the phones. They would sit you down, they say, here's the telephone system, this is how it works. You don't know anything different and you're now forced to learn that. Give it 2 or 3 days, you will be a master of that telephone system. And I guarantee you, human nature, if in 2 years' time they come in and say, we're going to put a new telephone system in, you will fight the change. You will start to think, well, why do we need to change? This one's good enough. I don't want to have to learn a whole new system because I'm good with this one. The same thing happens if you start in automatic mode. You'll get decent at that, you'll take some good photographs with that, but then all of a sudden you'll be comfortable in there. And when you want to try and move out, the thought of moving up to manual mode where you have to learn a little bit more about your camera, it can become quite daunting. Not if you start there in the first place. So step number 1, start in manual mode. Don't be scared of it. It's getting right wild out there. Since my last video we've had 2 storms, it's raining and it's windy. Hence the reason I'm back in the studio again. What is the exposure triangle and why do I need to know about it? Basically, there are 3 main components to controlling the light that comes into your camera, and ultimately that's what photographs are all about. You point the camera at something, amount of light comes in, it hits the sensor, and then that is represented as an image and it's saved to your memory card, and then you can put it on your computer. Very simplified, but that's all you need to know at this stage. The 3 things that affect that are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO settings. So let's look at them individually. Aperture is basically the little eye that's in your lens that opens and shuts to let in more light or less light. So basically, the wider the aperture, the more light that comes in, and the smaller the aperture, the less light that is allowed into the sensor. So why is aperture important? Well, you might find yourself shooting in a low light situation and you need to increase the exposure on your camera. The easiest thing and the natural thing to think is, I'll just open up the aperture, I'll let in more light, and that will work. But there are some downsides to that. If you open up the aperture, your depth of field, or basically how much of the image in front of you is in focus, will start to narrow. So if you want to take a photograph of a nice big vista in front of you, but there's some trees there just quite close to you, something in the mid distance, something in the far distance, then what you will find is that the front and back might be out of focus. By shutting the aperture down and shooting at f8 to f11, what you will find is that more of the scene from front to back will now be in focus, and that's more desirable, especially when you're doing landscape photography. With all of these things that we're talking about here, just experiment with them, because you can get nice results of having a shallow depth of field where the front's blurred, the back's blurred, but the thing that you want to focus on is nice and pin sharp. So the second part is the shutter speed. That controls how long the shutter is open to let light hit the sensor. The faster the shutter speed, the less time it's open and the less light will hit it. The slower the shutter speed, the longer it's open and the more light that the sensor can collect and then display in your photograph. Again, there are pros and cons to both here. If you have a very fast shutter speed, it means you can freeze fast action. So if you want to take a photograph of a bird that's flying by, you need a very fast shutter speed. However, if you're taking a landscape photography shot and you would like to slow down the shutter a little bit, which leaves it open for longer, you can then capture some movement in the clouds. But what will happen with a slow shutter, if you take the same photograph of the bird, it will have moved from one side of the frame to the other by the time the shutter has opened and closed, and you will have a blurred image of a bird crossing your frame. So the ISO is the last component of the exposure triangle, and it's commonly understood as the way that you can make your sensor more sensitive to light. Whilst there's a little bit more science behind it, that's ultimately what it does. So if you've already set your aperture, you're still trying to capture that bird in the sky, so you've set your shutter very, very fast, there still might not be enough light coming in, and when you look at the exposure on the back of your camera, it might still be too dark. That's where ISO comes in. You can now increase the sensitivity of your sensor, which lets more light come in and the image becomes brighter. As with the other two, there is a downside to that. If you bump your ISO too high, it can introduce digital noise to your photograph, and that can be seen most clearly in the shadows. So if you have a dark image and you try and boost your ISO very, very high, it'll start to look grainy and digitally. It's trying to get a balance between all of these three things, picking the appropriate aperture, getting the correct shutter speed, and then making sure your ISO settings complement the other two. Whilst that might sound confusing, it's trial and error. There's a ton of videos out there on the exposure triangle if you want to go out and learn more, but basically that's enough to get you out in the field and start to take some photographs. Remember, have fun and try. If you fail, it doesn't matter. You'll have learned something for the next time you go out. That brings us to being out in the field and using composition to make sure that your images look as good as they can be. If you're unaware of what composition is, it's basically structuring what you see in front of you to be as pleasing as possible to the person that will ultimately end up viewing the photograph. Now, if you've not heard of the rule of thirds, most cameras, if not all, have an option to switch a grid on that is 3x3, 2x2, et nominis uit patre. Most cameras have the facility to put a grid over your display so that you can see the lines of the thirds horizontally and a third vertically. If you place the main focus of your photograph on one of these lines, it is known to be more pleasing to the eye. Now I'm going to put up some examples of when I've got that right and when I've got that wrong. Again, there are plenty of videos on YouTube to help you learn about composition, but be thoughtful before you press the shutter button. What you want to try and do is avoid that temptation to stand there in awe looking at mountains out in front of you and just pick up your camera and take a photograph of it. There will be something somewhere round about you, whether it's an interesting rock formation or a lovely tree that's closer to you. Put that in the frame and it gives context and also depth of the image from front to back. So put a bit more thought into it. Location is tip number 4. Give yourself the best opportunity to take good photographs by going to good locations. If you go into your back garden in amongst your bins and try and capture an award-winning photograph, it's going to be very difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult. Yet if you save some money by not wasting it on gear acquisition syndrome, buy some tickets to go somewhere, train tickets, jump in the car, get some diesel, and go somewhere that you know you stand a better chance of getting a good photograph. Have a think about where you want to go. It's not a case of just grabbing your camera for half an hour, popping out the front door and coming back with an award-winning shot. Put some planning into it. That is part of the fun. Check what the weather's going to be like. Check the location you're going to be. Check the time that the sun's going to come up or it's going to set. But put some thought into what you do before you leave the house. For me, the planning stage is one of the most exciting stages. Where am I going? When am I going? What do I want to capture? And then do it. So you've done all these things, you've been out, you've thought about the exposure triangle, you've thought about composition, picked a really good location, and you've got some fantastic bangers in the bag. What do you do now? The one thing that I should have mentioned at the very start is that you will have the option to either shoot in RAW or to shoot in JPEG. Now JPEG's dead easy and it's like what you would normally get from shooting from a mobile phone, where the camera chooses how much saturation, what colours, how vibrant they should be, and it looks quite good out of camera. However, if you shoot in JPEG, they're smaller file sizes, so if you try to do some post-processing with that image afterwards, there's a limit to what you can do because the colours and the saturation and vibrance are baked into that JPEG image. It's far better to shoot in what's called RAW, which basically looks terrible when you take it out of the camera. It looks grey, flat, lifeless, but that's deliberate so that when you put it into something like Capture One or Lightroom or whatever editing software that you choose to use, you now have a lot of headroom to make it look like your image, to put your style on it. I personally use Lightroom, and I'll give you some examples of what some of my photographs look like before I've edited them straight out of camera and what they look like once they've been edited. It's another thing that you're going to have to learn if you've not used it, but I urge you, if you've spent the money on your camera, the money on your lens, you're traveling all over the place, then it makes sense to invest in a good editing software. The way I look at it, there is absolutely no point going to all that hassle of capturing the image if you're then not going to do something with it at the end. It takes a little bit more time, but if you fall in love with the editing process as well, you can end up with some really fantastic shots. And ultimately, that's why we're all here. So I hope I've managed to cover that in 10 minutes. I guess we'll find out once I edit the video. But just a recap of what we've talked about. Number 1, gear. Keep it simple. Don't waste your money on things that you don't need. 2, dip your toe in the water and start to learn about the exposure triangle. 3, composition. Make sure you put some thought into the shot that you're trying to take and don't just spray and pray. 4, think about the location and the time where you're going to go to that location. Give yourself an exciting day out rather than just going out because you've got a spare half hour. And then finally, invest in some post-processing software that can take your image from what you saw on the day to something mind-blowing. So no matter what you do, just make sure you enjoy yourself. Photography is a wonderful pastime and hobby. It gets me out to see places that I'd never even dreamed of. The benefits are just unfathomable. There's a ton of benefits. Your health will improve from walking up hills and walking places. Your mental health will improve from being outside, getting fresh air and doing something that you become passionate and that you love. And ultimately, the sense of satisfaction that you get when you know you've captured that best image. So enjoy it. Don't be scared of it. And remember, shoot in manual mode. Start from there and you'll never look back. If there's anything you'd like to ask about any one of those 5 topics, or if you think there's something that I haven't covered, please just leave a message in the comments. I would also like to see some of your photographs. If you want to post something or contact me, show me what you've done. If you want some advice on it, please do. I'm here to help. I honestly am. If you haven't subscribed, then please do. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. You know it all makes a difference. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.